Blood dripped onto frozen ground as Alora Voss gripped the axe tighter, her breath forming ghosts in the pre-dawn air. She wasn't supposed to be here. The cabin she stood before had been empty for 3 years, abandoned, cursed by rumor, forgotten by all. All except the man now riding toward her through the mist, his silhouette dark against the pale sky. Rhett Calder, the most feared rancher in the territory. A man who'd crushed trespassers, broken partnerships, and answered to no one. Their eyes met across 50 yards of snow. Neither blinked. This wasn't going to end with an apology. Welcome to a story of iron wills colliding in the brutal American frontier, where survival demands more than strength. It demands the courage to face those who believe they own everything. If you're watching from Chicago, Austin, Seattle, or anywhere between, drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and settle in. This is just the beginning. The Valley had no mercy. That was the first truth anyone learned if they survived their first winter in the Flint Creek territory. The second truth was simpler, harder. Rhett Calder owned everything the shadow of the mountains touched, and what he didn't own, he controlled. At 42, Rhett had built an empire from frozen dirt and endless determination. His ranch sprawled across 15,000 acres of some of the harshest land in the western frontier, land that killed the weak, tested the strong, and made legends of the few who could tame it. Cattle bearing his brand grazed from the northern ridge to the southern river basin. His horses were the finest within 200 miles. His word was law. But power like that didn't come from kindness. Rhett Calder was a man carved from stone and silence. 6'3", broad-shouldered, with hands that had built fences, broken horses, and broken men when necessary. His face was weathered by wind and sun, his gray eyes the color of winter sky, cold, clear, seeing everything. He spoke rarely, decided quickly, and never apologized. He trusted systems, order, discipline. People disappointed. That morning, before the sun cracked the horizon, Rhett was already in the saddle. His black gelding, Dante, moved beneath him with practiced ease as they navigated the western boundary of his land. This was routine. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, Rhett rode his territory. He checked fences, assessed grazing patterns, noted which sections needed rotation, which water sources ran clear. Control wasn't accidental, it was maintained. The air bit at his face, sharp and clean. Frost clung to the sagebrush, glittering like scattered diamonds. Rhett breathed deep, scanning the landscape with the methodical attention of a man who knew every stone, every tree, every rise and fall of earth. Then he saw it. Smoke. Thin, gray, rising from the direction of the old Mackenzie cabin. Rhett reined Dante to a stop, eyes narrowing. That cabin had been empty for 3 years. Not since old Samuel Mackenzie died and his children scattered east, wanting nothing to do with the brutal land that had claimed their father's health and happiness. The structure still stood, barely, but no one had touched it. No one had reason to. Until now. Trespassers weren't common, but they weren't unheard of. Drifters sometimes thought empty buildings meant free shelter. They learned otherwise when Rhett found them. He didn't tolerate theft, squatting, or excuses. His land, his rules. But something about this felt different. Rhett nudged Dante forward, moving at a steady walk toward the source of the smoke. As he drew closer, details emerged. The cabin's roof had been patched, fresh lumber visible against weathered gray. The door, which had hung crooked on broken hinges, now sat square in its frame. Firewood was stacked beside the entrance, neat and considerable. Someone wasn't just passing through. Someone was settling in. Rhett's jaw tightened. He dismounted 20 yards from the cabin, looping Dante's reins around a low branch. His boots crunched through frost-crusted snow as he approached, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. Not drawn, just ready. Always ready. The door opened before he reached it, and there she stood, a woman, alone, facing him without fear. She was younger than he'd expected, late 20s, perhaps early 30s, but her eyes held the kind of weariness that aged people faster than years. Dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, work-worn clothes that had seen better seasons, hands red from cold and labor. She held an axe loosely in her right hand, not raised but not discarded either. Their eyes met. Rhett stopped 10 feet away, assessing. She wasn't panicking, wasn't backing down, wasn't offering explanations or excuses, just standing there watching him with the same careful attention he was giving her. "This is private property," Rhett said, his voice low and even. "Not a threat, a fact." "I know," the woman replied. Her voice was steady, clear, no tremor, no apology. "Then you know you're trespassing." "I'm aware." Rhett's eyes flicked to the cabin behind her, then back. "You planning to explain yourself, or do I need to escort you off my land?" The woman shifted her weight slightly, still not backing down. "I'm Alara Voss. I've been here 4 days. I've repaired the roof, replaced the door hinges, cleared the chimney, and cut enough firewood to last 2 weeks. I haven't touched your cattle, your fences, or anything else. Just this cabin." "That doesn't answer my question." "I need a place to stay," Alara said simply. "This cabin was abandoned. I'm making it livable. Without permission. Would you have given it?" The question hung in the frozen air between them. Rhett studied her face, no defiance for its own sake, no bravado, just calm, practical honesty. Most people who trespassed either lied, begged, or ran. This woman did none of those things. "No," Rhett said finally. "I wouldn't have." Then asking would have been pointless. Despite himself, Rhett felt a flicker of something. Not quite respect, not quite curiosity, but close to both. This woman had backbone. Stupid backbone, maybe, but backbone nonetheless. "You know who I am?" he asked. "Rhett Calder," Alara said. "You own everything from here to the ridge. You don't negotiate, you don't make exceptions, and you don't tolerate trespassers." She paused. "I'm aware of the risks." "And yet here you are." "Here I am." Rhett's hand dropped away from his revolver. She wasn't a threat, not the physical kind anyway. But she was a complication, and complications disrupted order. "You got family?" he asked. "Someone who knows you're here?" "No." "Work? Income?" "Not currently." "So you're broke, alone, and squatting on my land in the middle of winter." Rhett shook his head slowly. "That's either brave or suicidal. Haven't decided which." "Maybe both," Alara said, and for the first time the faintest hint of something, maybe dark humor, maybe exhaustion, crossed her face. Rhett should have sent her packing right then. That's what he would have done for anyone else. No exceptions, no complications. But something about this woman, her calm in the face of certain eviction, her practical repairs, the fact that she'd chosen one of the harshest locations on his land instead of something easier, made him pause. "You know how to work?" he asked. Alara's eyes narrowed slightly. "Yes." "Cattle? Horses? Fences? I can learn what I don't know." "That's not an answer." "I've worked farms," Alara said. "Grew up on one. Planting, harvesting, animal care. I can handle physical labor. I don't quit when things get hard." Rhett considered. He was short-handed. 2 ranch hands had quit last month, unable to handle the brutal winter work and Rhett's exacting standards. The western section, where this cabin sat, was the hardest to maintain. Remote, cold, unforgiving. He needed someone willing to do the work no one else wanted. But trust. That was earned, not given. "Here's the deal," Rhett said, his voice hardening into the tone his workers knew meant non-negotiable terms. "You can stay. In exchange, you work. Every day. Dawn to dusk when needed. Western fence line maintenance, water source checks, predator watch, whatever needs doing. You take orders, you meet standards, you don't question my decisions." Alara listened without interruption. "You get the cabin," Rhett continued. "Firewood access. Basic supplies once a month. No wages for the first 3 months. You're working off the trespass and the shelter. After that, if you're still here and you've proven yourself, we talk terms." "That's exploitation," Alara said quietly. "That's reality," Rhett shot back. "You came here with nothing, took what wasn't yours, and now you want fair wages? Earn them first. Prove you're worth more than the trouble you're causing." The silence stretched. Wind whistled through the pine trees. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried. Alara's jaw tightened, but her eyes never left his. "And if I refuse? Then you leave. Now. Today. And if I find you on my land again, I involve the law." Rhett's voice was flat, final. Your choice. Most people would have argued, complained about the unfairness, demanded better, but Alara Voss wasn't most people. I accept, she said. Rhett nodded once. Be at the main ranch house tomorrow morning, 4 o'clock. I'll show you what needs doing. I'll be there. Without another word, Rhett turned and walked back to Dante. He mounted smoothly, gathering the reins. As he rode away, he glanced back once. Alara stood in the cabin doorway, watching him leave, axe still in hand. Something about the image stayed with him longer than it should have. The main ranch house sat at the heart of Calder territory, a massive structure built from local timber and stone designed to withstand anything the frontier could throw at it. 2 stories, wide porches, stone chimneys at either end, functional, solid, built to last. Rhett lived there alone. He'd been married once, years ago. Margaret. She'd lasted 2 winters before the isolation, the cold, and Rhett's relentless work schedule drove her back east. No children, no reconciliation, just signed papers and silence. He didn't blame her. This life wasn't for everyone. That night, Rhett sat in his study, ledgers open before him. Numbers, supplies, projected losses from winter attrition, everything documented, tracked, managed. This was how empires survived, not through luck or hope, but through meticulous attention to detail. But his mind kept drifting. Alara Voss, alone, rebuilding, refusing to beg. Why? People didn't choose hardship without reason. They ran from something or toward something. She wasn't running. Her calm demeanor, her acceptance of brutal terms suggested someone who'd already faced worse. So what was she moving toward? Rhett closed the ledger with a snap. Speculation was pointless. Either she'd prove herself or she wouldn't. Either way, it didn't matter who she'd been, only what she could do. That was the rule he lived by. Actions, not words. Results, not promises. Tomorrow would reveal which category Alara Voss belonged to. 4 o'clock came dark and freezing. Rhett was already in the yard when Alara appeared, walking the 3 miles from the cabin to the main house through pre-dawn darkness. No horse, no complaints, just punctual arrival. You walk here? Rhett asked, surprised despite himself. Didn't have another option. 3 miles in the dark, in winter. I've walked farther. Rhett studied her face in the lantern light. No bravado, just fact. Come on, he said, gesturing toward the barn. We've got work. The western fence line stretched for miles, running along rocky terrain that made maintenance brutal. Posts worked loose in frozen ground, wires sagged under ice weight, and predators, wolves, mountain lions, constantly tested for weaknesses. Rhett handed Alara a post driver, a hammer, and a pouch of staples. Every post, check for stability. Redrive anything loose, replace rotted wood, tighten wire. No gaps big enough for a coyote pup. Alara looked at the tools, then at the endless line of fence disappearing into gray dawn. Understood. I'll be checking, Rhett warned. If the work's sloppy, you do it again. It won't be sloppy. They worked in silence, separated by 50 yards. Rhett moved with practiced efficiency, his movements economical and precise. He expected Alara to struggle. Most people did, especially in cold that made metal tools painful to grip, ground that resisted every post strike. But when he circled back an hour later, checking her section, he stopped. The work was good. Not perfect, but solid. Posts driven deep and straight, wire taut, staples placed correctly. She'd even cleared brush from around the base of each post, preventing rot. Where'd you learn fence work? Rhett asked. Alara didn't look up from her hammering. Farm I grew up on. My father built fences that lasted 20 years. He taught me to do it right the first time. Smart man. He was. Past tense. Rhett noted it, but didn't push. People's pasts were their business unless it affected their work. They continued through the morning, the sun climbing slowly, temperature rising just enough to make breathing slightly easier. Rhett worked alongside her, not because he needed to, but because he never asked anyone to do work he wouldn't do himself. Around noon, they paused near a stream. Rhett pulled bread and dried meat from his saddlebag, handing half to Alara without comment. She accepted, eating efficiently, wasting no motion. You always this quiet? Rhett asked after several minutes of silence. You always this demanding? Alara countered. Despite himself, Rhett's mouth twitched, almost a smile. Fair enough. I don't talk just to fill silence, Alara said. If I have something worth saying, I'll say it. That's rare. What is? Someone who doesn't need constant noise. Rhett bit into his bread, chewing thoughtfully. Most people talk because they're uncomfortable with quiet. Are you uncomfortable with it? No? Then we'll get along fine. They worked until sunset, 9 solid hours of brutal labor. When Rhett finally called it, Alara's hands were bleeding through torn gloves, her face wind-burned, her breath coming hard, but every post stood straight, every wire held tight. Same time tomorrow, Rhett said, mounting Dante. I'll be here. Rhett watched her start the long walk back to the cabin, her figure growing smaller against the darkening landscape. No complaints, no requests for easier assignments, just acceptance of the terms she'd agreed to. Maybe, he thought, this wouldn't be a mistake after all. Indeed, days became weeks. Alara proved herself again and again. She showed up before dawn, worked past dusk when needed, and never made excuses. The western section, long neglected because no one wanted the assignment, began to show improvement. Fences held, water sources ran clear, predator signs decreased as Alara learned to set proper deterrents. Rhett's other workers noticed. Who's the woman? Jackson, his foreman, asked one evening. She's out there every day, rain or shine. Someone earning her keep, Rhett replied. She's good, Jackson admitted. Better than the last 3 we hired for that section. They all quit within a month. She's not quitting. Why not? You're not exactly going easy on her. Rhett's eyes narrowed slightly. You think I should? I think most people would have walked after the first week, Jackson said carefully. She's either desperate or stubborn as hell. Maybe both. You going to tell me her story? Not my story to tell. Jackson knew better than to push. Rhett's privacy rules applied to everyone, including mysterious women rebuilding abandoned cabins. But the question lingered in Rhett's mind, too. What was Alara's story? She worked with the intensity of someone trying to outrun something or prove something. But what? He got his first clue 6 weeks into their arrangement. Rhett rode out to check the southern water source, a spring-fed pool that required constant monitoring for contamination. He found Alara there, kneeling by the water's edge, staring at something in her hand. Problem with the water? Rhett called out. Alara startled, the first time he'd ever seen her genuinely surprised. She stood quickly, closing her fist around whatever she'd been holding. No, she said. Water's clear, flow's good. Rhett dismounted, approaching the pool. He checked it himself. Old habits. She was right. Everything looked fine. What's in your hand? He asked. Alara hesitated. For a long moment, Rhett thought she wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, she opened her palm. A small piece of carved wood. A horse, barely 2 inches tall, smoothed by handling and time. Yours? Rhett asked. It was my daughter's, Alara said quietly. The words hung in the cold air like breath made solid. Rhett's eyes flicked to her face. Was? Alara's jaw tightened. She died 4 years ago. Fever. She was 6. I'm sorry. Everyone says that. Alara's voice was flat, distant. It doesn't change anything. Rhett understood that tone. He'd used it himself when Margaret left. When people offered sympathy he didn't want or need. Some losses couldn't be soothed by words. Her father? He asked. Died 2 years later. Different fever. Alara slipped the carved horse into her pocket. That's when I lost the farm. Couldn't manage the payments alone. Bank took everything. That how you ended up here? Eventually. Rhett wanted to ask more, wanted to understand the journey from lost farm to trespassing in his abandoned cabin, but something in Alara's posture told him she was done sharing. The work you're doing, Rhett said instead. It's good, better than good. When the 3 months are up, we'll talk real wages. Alara looked at him, genuine surprise crossing her features. You mean that? I don't say things I don't mean. For the first time since they'd met, Alara smiled. Small, brief, but real. Thank you. Rhett nodded, then mounted Dante and rode back toward the main house. But her story stayed with him, filling in pieces of the puzzle. She wasn't running from weakness. She was rebuilding from loss. That, Rhett understood. Winter deepened. Snow fell in heavy sheets, blanketing the valley in white silence. Temperatures dropped so low that water buckets froze solid overnight. Breath crystallized instantly, and exposed skin burned within minutes. This was the season that separated survivors from corpses. Alara kept working. Rhett watched her adapt, learning which areas needed daily attention, which could wait, how to move efficiently through deep snow, when to push, and when to preserve energy. She wasn't just surviving, she was mastering the land. One brutal morning, with wind howling and visibility near zero, Rhett rode out to call off the day's work. Conditions were too dangerous, even he wouldn't risk it. But when he reached the western section, he found Alara already there, reinforcing a fence section that had taken damage during the night. "What are you doing?" Rhett shouted over the wind. "Fixing this before we lose cattle," Alara shouted back. "I didn't tell you to work today. The fence doesn't care about your schedule." Rhett swung down from Dante, grabbing extra wire from his pack. If she was stubborn enough to work in a blizzard, he wasn't letting her do it alone. They worked side by side, hands numb, faces stinging, words impossible over the roaring wind. But the fence held. When they finished, both were coated in ice and snow, shaking from cold. "You're insane," Rhett yelled. "So are you," Alara yelled back. "You came out here too." They stared at each other through the whipping snow, and suddenly Rhett was laughing, actually laughing, something he almost never did. The absurdity of it, two people screaming at each other about responsibility while freezing to death in a blizzard, struck him as darkly hilarious. Alara started laughing too. They made it back to the main house, where Rhett insisted she stay until the storm passed. No arguments, no 3-mile walk through whiteout conditions. She didn't argue. In the warmth of the main house, with hot coffee and a roaring fire, Rhett saw Alara clearly for the first time. Not as a trespasser or a worker, but as a person. Someone who'd lost everything, rebuilt from nothing, and refused to break. "Why this land?" Rhett asked. "Why not somewhere easier, somewhere with people, civilization?" Alara stared into her coffee. "Because easy didn't matter anymore. I tried easy. I tried building something safe, something stable. Life took it anyway." She looked up, meeting his eyes. "Out here, the land doesn't lie. It doesn't pretend to be kind. It just is. If you're strong enough, you survive. If not, you don't. There's honesty in that." Rhett understood completely. That night, as the storm raged outside, they talked. Really talked. About loss, about building, about what it meant to choose this brutal, beautiful, unforgiving life. And Rhett realized something that surprised him. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. Spring arrived slowly, grudgingly. Snow melted into mud, frozen ground thawed, and the valley transformed from white death to brown possibility. Alara's 3-month trial period ended. Rhett called her to the main house on a Sunday morning, unusual timing that made her wary. When she arrived, he was waiting in his study, paperwork spread across the desk. "Sit," Rhett said, gesturing to a chair. Alara sat, tension visible in her shoulders. Rhett slid a paper across the desk. "Official employment contract, $12 a week, paid monthly. Room and board. You keep the cabin, I'll stock it with proper supplies. Medical expenses covered if you're injured on the job. Sundays off, unless there's an emergency." Alara stared at the contract, then at Rhett. "This is generous." "It's fair," Rhett corrected. "You've earned every cent. The Western section hasn't looked this good in 5 years. You've proven yourself." "What about the 3 months I worked for nothing?" "Consider it paid training." Rhett's mouth quirked slightly. "Sign it or don't. Your choice." Alara picked up the pen, hesitated, then signed her name in careful script. When she looked up, something in her expression had shifted. Not gratitude exactly, but recognition. Respect earned and given. "Thank you," she said simply. "Don't thank me," Rhett replied. "Just keep doing the work." She stood to leave, but paused at the door. "Rhett?" He looked up. "Why did you give me a chance? That first day you could have just run me off. Why didn't you?" Rhett considered the question. Really considered it. The honest answer surprised him. Because you weren't afraid, he said finally. Everyone else who's trespassed, they've either lied or begged. You just stood there, ready to face whatever came next. That kind of courage is rare. Seems stupid to waste it. Alara nodded slowly. I'm glad you didn't. After she left, Rhett sat alone in his study, contract filed, term settled. But something had changed. The valley felt less empty. The work felt less isolating. For the first time since Margaret left, Rhett wondered if maybe, possibly, he'd been wrong about people. Maybe not all of them disappointed. 2 weeks later, trouble arrived on the afternoon stage. Rhett was in town for supplies when he saw the man. Expensive suit, leather satchel, calculating eyes that assessed everything like inventory. City man. Probably a banker or lawyer, which in frontier towns usually meant the same thing. Someone come to take what others had built. Rhett didn't think much of it until he overheard the conversation in the general store. Looking for property records, the suit was saying to the clerk. So specifically parcels that changed hands in the last 5 years. Foreclosures, sales under duress, that sort of thing. That'd be at the land office, the clerk replied. 2 blocks down. Much obliged. Rhett watched the man leave, unease prickling at the base of his skull. Something felt wrong. He couldn't name it, but instinct, honed over decades of surviving betrayal and hardship, was screaming warning. He followed. The land office was a small building, poorly heated, run by an ancient clerk named Morrison who'd been recording deeds since before statehood. Rhett entered quietly, positioning himself near the back where he could listen without being obvious. The suit was already talking. I'm looking for properties acquired through foreclosure between 1878 and 1883, specifically farms, homesteads, small holdings. Morrison shuffled through dusty ledgers. That's a fair number. You looking to buy? Potentially. I represent investors interested in consolidation opportunities. Translation: vultures looking to snap up desperate people's land for nothing. Rhett's jaw tightened. Morrison produced a list. The suit reviewed it, nodding occasionally. Then he paused, tapping one entry. This one. The Voss property. 200 acres, foreclosed 1881. What happened there? Rhett's blood went cold. Morrison squinted at the record. Ah, yes. Widow couldn't make payments after her husband died. Bank took it back, sold it to a development company out of Denver. Development company? The suit's interest sharpened. Which one? Let me see. Morrison flipped pages. Frontier Holdings, LLC. The suit smiled, a predator's smile. Perfect. And the current status? Still held by Frontier Holdings, far as I know. They bought up several parcels that year. Rhett left before hearing more. His mind raced, pieces clicking together with sickening clarity. Alara Voss. Widow. Lost Farm. 1881. Frontier Holdings, LLC. He'd heard that name before. Whispers in saloons, warnings from other ranchers. A company that specialized in acquiring property from vulnerable owners. Widows, immigrants, anyone who couldn't fight back. Legal on paper, criminal in practice. Forged deeds. Falsified records. Pressure tactics. Fraud masquerading as business. And Alara had been one of their victims. Rhett rode back to his ranch with purpose burning in his chest. He found Alara repairing a water trough, sleeves rolled up, focused on her work. We need to talk, Rhett said without preamble. Alara looked up, reading his expression. What's wrong? Your farm, the one you lost. Who bought it? Alara's face went carefully blank. Why? Because there's a man in town asking questions about Frontier Holdings foreclosures, and your name came up. The color drained from Alara's face. No. Tell me what happened, Rhett demanded. All of it. Alara set down her tools, hands shaking slightly. After my husband died, I couldn't make the loan payments alone. I tried. Worked myself half to death trying. But it wasn't enough. The bank sent someone to discuss terms, a representative from Frontier Holdings. He said they'd buy the debt, give me time to get on my feet. But they didn't. 2 months later, they foreclosed anyway. Said I'd missed payments I know I made. They had paperwork, signatures I didn't remember signing. My lawyer said there was nothing I could do. Their documentation was perfect. Alara's voice cracked. They took everything, the farm, my home, everything my husband and I built. Did you ever see the actual transfer documents? No. They told me it wasn't necessary, that it was all handled properly. Rhett swore under his breath. Classic fraud, forged records, manufactured debt, present victims with impossible choices. By the time anyone realized what happened, the land was gone and the company had vanished behind layers of legal protection. This development company, Rhett said slowly, you know who runs it? A man named Sterling, Marcus Sterling. Alara's eyes hardened. I tried to fight him, went to lawyers, the sheriff, anyone who'd listen. They all said the same thing. The paperwork was legal, the foreclosure proper. No one would stand against him. Because he's got money and connections. Because people like me don't matter. The bitterness in her voice cut deeper than any knife. Rhett was quiet for a long moment, mind working through possibilities. Then he made a decision, one that would either prove his instincts right or cost him dearly. How would you like to get your farm back? He asked. Alara stared at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. That's impossible. Nothing's impossible, just expensive, dangerous, or both. Rhett's eyes locked on hers. I'm asking if you want to fight. Against Marcus Sterling? Against Frontier Holdings? Alara shook her head. Rhett, these people have lawyers, judges in their pockets. And I have resources they don't expect, Rhett interrupted. Money, influence, a reputation for not backing down, plus something more important. What? I'm not afraid of them. Alara searched his face, looking for the lie, the catch. The moment he'd reveal this was just talk. But Rhett's expression was stone-solid serious. Why would you do this? She whispered. Why would you risk everything for my farm? Because they're cheating, Rhett said simply. And I don't tolerate cheating. Not on my land, not against my people. His jaw set. You work for me now. That makes you my responsibility, and nobody steals from what's mine. In that moment, Alara understood. This wasn't about charity. This was about Rhett's code, his rigid sense of order, justice, and control. Someone had violated his territory by harming one of his own. That was personal. What do you need from me? Alara asked. Every detail you remember, names, dates, documents, everything. And then? Rhett's smile was sharp, cold, and absolutely certain. Then we go to war. That evening, Alara sat across from Rhett in his study, the room lit by oil lamps that cast long shadows across maps and ledgers. Outside, darkness had fallen complete and absolute, the kind of blackness that swallowed sound and made the world feel smaller, more intimate. Rhett had pushed aside his usual paperwork, replacing it with blank sheets and a pen. Start from the beginning, he said. When did you first hear from Frontier Holdings? Alara's hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, drawing warmth from the ceramic. October 1880, 6 months after my husband died. A man came to the farm, said his name was William Garrett, that he represented a company that specialized in helping struggling landowners. What did he look like? Tall? Thin? Spoke well? Dressed better? Had papers in a leather case? Everything official looking. Alara's eyes went distant, remembering. He was kind at first, said he understood how hard it was for a widow alone. Offered to buy the debt from the bank, give me flexible payment terms, time to get back on my feet. Rhett wrote quickly, his handwriting surprisingly neat. And you believed him? I was desperate, Alara said quietly. The bank was demanding full payment within 90 days. I didn't have it. Garrett offered hope. What were the terms? $200 immediately to satisfy the bank, then $50 quarterly until the balance was paid. He said it would take about 3 years at that rate. Rhett's pen paused. That's reasonable. Too reasonable. That's what I thought later, Alara agreed. But at the time, I just felt grateful. I signed everything he put in front of me. Do you remember what you signed? Alara closed her eyes, forcing herself back to that day, that moment when she'd thought salvation had arrived instead of ruin. There were 3 documents. The first was the debt transfer, moving my obligation from the bank to Frontier Holdings. The second was a payment schedule. The third, she hesitated. He said it was standard insurance in case something happened to me, protection for both parties. Let me guess, Rhett said, his voice hardening. That third document was actually a deed transfer, contingent on default. I don't know. I never saw it again. Rhett set down his pen, leaning back in his chair. This was classic predatory lending. Bury the real terms in complex language, rush the signing, make sure the victim never gets copies of what they've agreed to. Legal enough to survive casual scrutiny, criminal enough to destroy lives. When did things go wrong? He asked. 4 months later, February 1881. Alara's jaw tightened. I'd made every payment on time, walked 15 miles to town each quarter to hand-deliver the money personally. Got receipts every time. You still have those receipts? No. The word came out bitter. They were in the farmhouse when Frontier Holdings took possession. Everything I owned was in that house. Of course, evidence disappeared along with the property. What happened in February? Rhett pressed. Garrett came back, but he wasn't kind anymore. Alara's voice dropped. He said I'd missed 2 payments, that according to their records I was in default. I showed him my receipts, but he said they were invalid, that payments had to be made through official company channels, not directly to him. Even though he'd accepted them personally. Even though... Alara's hands trembled slightly. He gave me 2 weeks to pay everything I supposedly owed, plus penalties. Nearly $400. I didn't have it. I couldn't possibly get it. And 2 weeks later, they foreclosed. Had the sheriff escort me off my own land. Said the property now belonged to Frontier Holdings, legally purchased through my defaulted debt agreement. Alara's voice cracked. They took everything. My home, my daughter's grave, everything. The last part hit Rhett like a physical blow. They'd taken the land where her child was buried. That went beyond business, beyond fraud. That was cruelty. Where's your daughter buried now? He asked quietly. Still there, on land I can't visit without trespassing. Alara wiped at her eyes angrily. I tried to fight it, hired a lawyer with the last money I had. He reviewed the documents, the ones Frontier Holdings provided, and said everything appeared legal. The debt transfer was properly filed. The foreclosure followed correct procedure. Without my copies of the receipts, without proof of payment, there was nothing he could do. So you walked away. What choice did I have? I had no money, no home, no proof. The law was on their side. Alara looked at Rhett, her eyes hard despite the tears. I spent 2 years drifting, working any job that would take me, trying to forget, but I couldn't. That land was mine. My husband and I built that farm from nothing. Our daughter played in those fields, and they stole it with paperwork and lies. Rhett was quiet for a long moment, absorbing everything. Then he stood, walking to the window. The darkness outside reflected his own face back at him, shadowed and grim. This Marcus Sterling, Rhett said. You ever meet him directly? No, just his representatives, but I heard stories. Other families who lost land the same way. Always the same pattern. Helpful at first, then suddenly you're in default, then you're evicted. All perfectly legal on paper. How many families? I don't know exactly. Maybe a dozen in our county alone. Rhett turned from the window, his mind already working through strategy. A dozen families meant a pattern. Pattern meant predictability. Predictability meant vulnerability. Here's what we're going to do, Rhett said, returning to the desk. First, we need to verify that Frontier Holdings still owns your property. If they've sold it or transferred it, that complicates things. How do we verify that? Land records. Same office that Suit was visiting today. I'll go tomorrow, review the chain of title. Rhett's eyes narrowed. Then we need to find out who Marcus Sterling really is. Companies are just paper. There's always a person behind them. We find the person, we find the weakness. And if there is no weakness? Everyone has one, Rhett said with absolute certainty. You just have to know where to look. Alara studied him across the desk. This hard man who'd given her shelter when she had nothing, work when she was desperate, and now was offering something she'd thought impossible, justice. Why are you really doing this? She asked again. And don't tell me it's about your people or your code. There's something more. Rhett was silent for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, he answered honestly. Because I've seen this before, he said quietly. Not exactly the same, but close enough. My father built this ranch from nothing, worked himself to death doing it. When I was 15, a land company tried to claim we didn't have clear title to the northern section. Said some survey error meant those acres actually belonged to them. What happened? My father fought them, went to lawyers, filed challenges, spent money we didn't have on legal fees. The stress of it killed him. Heart gave out 2 weeks before the case was decided. Rhett's jaw clenched. We won. The land was ours. But my father died anyway, and the company just moved on to the next target. I'm sorry. I'm not telling you for sympathy, Rhett said sharply. I'm telling you so you understand. These people, these companies that steal land from people who can't fight back, they rely on exhaustion. On victims giving up because the fight costs too much. Well, I'm not exhausted, and I sure as hell don't give up. Alara understood then. This wasn't just about her farm. This was about every person who'd been crushed by people with more money, better lawyers, and no conscience. Rhett couldn't save his father, but maybe he could save this. So we fight, Alara said. We fight, Rhett confirmed. They worked late into the night, Alara recounting every detail she could remember while Rhett documented everything. Names, dates, descriptions, amounts. By the time exhaustion forced them to stop, they had the skeleton of a case. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next morning, Rhett rode into town alone, leaving Alara to manage the ranch work. He didn't want her anywhere near the land office. If Sterling's people were still watching those records, better they didn't know she was involved yet. Morrison looked up when Rhett entered, recognition crossing his weathered face. Mr. Calder, twice in 1 week. That's unusual. Need to research some property records, Rhett said, keeping his voice casual. The old Voss farm, 200 acres, foreclosed in 81. Morrison shuffled to the filing cabinets, muttering about organization. He returned with a thick folder, dropping it on the counter with a cloud of dust. There you go, though I'm curious why you're interested. That property's nowhere near your holdings. Just curious about development patterns, Rhett lied smoothly. Thinking about expansion, he opened the folder, scanning documents with practiced efficiency. The foreclosure notice was there, dated February 15, 1881. The debt transfer from the bank to Frontier Holdings, dated October 1880. Everything official, stamped, recorded. But something was wrong. Rhett pulled out the deed transfer, the document that moved ownership from Alara to Frontier Holdings. The signature at the bottom was supposed to be Alara's, but the handwriting looked wrong, too smooth, too confident. Nothing like the careful script he'd seen her use on her employment contract. Morrison, Rhett called. You got a magnifying glass? Somewhere. The old clerk rummaged in a drawer, producing a scratched lens. Why? Rhett didn't answer, instead examining the signature closely. The ink was darker in some places, lighter in others. The pressure inconsistent. And there, barely visible, a slight tremor in one letter that suggested hesitation. This wasn't Alara's signature. It was a forgery. Not even a good one, if you knew what to look for. Rhett's pulse quickened. This was the weakness. Frontier Holdings had been so confident in their victims' inability to fight back that they'd gotten sloppy. The signature was supposed to make the transfer look voluntary. Instead, it was evidence of fraud. I need copies of these documents, Rhett said. That'll cost you 10 cents per page. I'll take everything in this folder. Morrison's eyebrows rose, but he didn't argue with money. While he worked the copy press, Rhett continued examining the file. He found the payment records Frontier Holdings had submitted, showing Alara in default. Convenient that her receipts had disappeared while these remained. Then he found something else. A notation in the margin of the debt transfer, barely legible. WG, commission 15%. William Garrett. The man who'd approached Alara, who'd taken her payments and then claimed they didn't count. He'd been working on commission, getting paid for every property Frontier Holdings acquired. That explained his transformation from helpful to hostile. Alara's default wasn't a failure, it was the plan. Rhett paid for the copies and left, his mind racing. He had evidence of forgery. He had proof of commission-based acquisition. He had a pattern of similar foreclosures. Individually, these things might not be enough. But together they were a weapon. Back at the ranch, he spread the documents across his desk, Alara standing beside him as he explained what he'd found. That's not my signature, she confirmed, staring at the deed transfer. Look at the V in Voss. I always make it sharp, angular. This one's rounded. That's what I thought, Rhett pointed to the commission notation. And this connects Garrett directly to fraud. He wasn't helping you, he was hunting you. Alara's hands clenched into fists. So we can prove they stole the farm. Maybe. But proving fraud and getting your land back are two different things. Rhett leaned back, thinking, we need leverage, something that makes them want to settle rather than fight. Like what? Like threatening to expose the entire operation. If we can prove they did this to you, we can probably prove they did it to others. That's a pattern of criminal behavior. That's prison time for everyone involved. Would they believe us? We're nobody. They're a company with resources. Rhett smiled, cold and sharp. That's where you're wrong. You might be nobody to them. But I'm Rhett Calder. I own 15,000 acres, employ 30 men, and sit on the Territorial Land Board. When I make accusations, people listen. Understanding dawned in Alara's eyes. You're going to use your reputation. I'm going to use everything I have, Rhett corrected. Money, influence, connections. Whatever it takes to back these bastards into a corner where their only choice is giving you back what they stole. And if they don't back down, then we go public. Newspapers, territorial government, federal land office. We make so much noise that they can't operate anymore. We destroy them. The certainty in his voice sent a chill through Alara, not of fear, but of recognition. This was Rhett Calder at his most dangerous. Not violent, not reckless, but absolutely committed to winning. She'd seen him manage his ranch with that same focused intensity. Now that focus was aimed at her enemies. When do we start? She asked. Tomorrow. I'm calling in some favors. Those favors began with a telegraph to Denver. Rhett's lawyer, a sharp-minded man named Theodore Ashford who'd handled the ranch's legal matters for a decade, responded within hours. He'd heard of Frontier Holdings. They had a reputation. Not a good one. Interesting timing, Ashford's telegram read. Territorial legislature investigating predatory land practices. Your case could be useful. We'll research and advise. Stand by. The next 3 days passed in tense waiting. Alara worked the western section, her mind churning with possibilities and fears. What if this didn't work? What if Sterling had too much protection? What if she'd gotten Rhett involved in something that would cost him everything? Rhett, meanwhile, contacted other ranchers, asking casual questions about land companies, foreclosures, suspicious transfers. The responses painted a damning picture. Frontier Holdings had been operating across 3 territories, targeting vulnerable owners, widows, immigrants, anyone without the resources to fight back. But something else emerged too. Whispers that Frontier Holdings was facing financial pressure, that their aggressive acquisition strategy had overextended them, that they'd borrowed heavily against properties they'd seized, gambling on quick resales that hadn't materialized. They were vulnerable. On the 4th day, Ashford arrived in person, stepping off the afternoon stage with his leather case and grim expression. Rhett met him at the hotel, where they spent 3 hours reviewing documents, discussing strategy, planning their approach. When Rhett returned to the ranch that evening, Alara was waiting on the porch. Well? She asked. We have a case, Rhett said, dismounting. Not just against Frontier Holdings, against Marcus Sterling personally. Ashford found evidence that Sterling's been using company funds for personal expenses. That's fraud against his own investors. Will that help us? It means he's desperate. Desperate people make mistakes, and desperate people settle when cornered. Rhett climbed the porch steps, standing beside her. Tomorrow, Ashford sends Sterling a letter. We lay out what we know, the forged signature, the pattern of fraud, the commission scheme. We give him 1 week to return your property with clear title. If he refuses, we file criminal charges and civil suit simultaneously. He'll fight, Alara said. Men like him always fight. Let him, Rhett replied. We're not afraid of a fight. The letter went out the next morning by express courier. Ashford had crafted it carefully. Professional, precise, devastating. It outlined the evidence in clinical detail, named specific crimes, cited relevant statutes. Then it offered the settlement. Return the Voss property immediately, sign a document admitting the foreclosure was improper, and resign from Frontier Holdings. In exchange, no criminal charges would be filed. It was a brutal ultimatum. Sterling would lose everything: his company, his reputation, his freedom if he refused. Now they waited. Days crawled past like wounded animals. Alara threw herself into work, repairing fences with furious energy, as if physical labor could burn away the anxiety. Rhett maintained his routines, but his attention was divided, always part of him listening for the sound of a telegraph messenger, a courier, any response. 6 days after the letter was sent, a man arrived at the ranch. Not Sterling, a lawyer representing him. Junior partner from a Denver firm, young and nervous, clearly sent to do the job no senior attorney wanted. "Mr. Calder?" the lawyer asked, standing in Rhett's study with visible discomfort. "My name is David Morrison. I represent Marcus Sterling and Frontier Holdings." "I know who you represent," Rhett said coldly. "What's your answer?" Morrison opened his case, pulling out documents. Mr. Sterling categorically denies all allegations of fraud or improper conduct. The Voss foreclosure was handled according to proper legal procedure. All documentation was properly filed and recorded. "That documentation includes a forged signature," Rhett said. "That makes it worthless." Mr. Sterling believes the signature is genuine and is prepared to defend that position in court. "Let me be clear, Mr. Morrison." Rhett stood, his full height and presence making the younger man step back. "I don't bluff. I don't make threats I won't follow through on. If your client wants a court fight, he'll get one. But it won't just be about one farm. We'll subpoena every foreclosure Frontier Holdings has executed in the past 5 years. We'll depose every victim, examine every signature, audit every document. We'll expose the entire operation." Morrison's face paled. "Mr. Calder, you should understand. Mr. Sterling has substantial resources. Litigation could be very expensive, very protracted." "I have more resources," Rhett said flatly. "And I don't care how long it takes. Your client stole from someone under my protection. That makes it personal. So you go back to Denver and you tell Marcus Sterling that he has 3 choices: settle on our terms, fight, and lose everything, or run. Those are his options. He has 48 hours to decide." That's unreasonable." "That's reality," Rhett corrected, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "Now get off my property." Morrison left, documents undelivered, settlement offer rejected. When the dust from his departing carriage settled, Alara emerged from where she'd been listening in the hallway. "He's going to fight," she said. "Probably," Rhett agreed. "But now he knows we're serious, and he knows we have evidence. That changes the calculation. What if he has judges in his pocket? What if the system protects him?" Rhett walked to the window, watching the sun set over his land his father had died protecting, land he'd sworn to defend against anyone who tried to take it. "Then we burn the system down," he said quietly. "There's more than one way to get justice." Alara felt something shift inside her. Fear, yes, but also something fiercer. Hope. Real, dangerous hope that maybe this time the powerful wouldn't win. That maybe this time deep theft would be answered with consequences. "What do we do now?" she asked. "We wait," Rhett said, "and we prepare for war." The 48 hours passed in electric silence. Rhett and Ashford prepared for every possibility. Court filings ready to submit, witness lists compiled, evidence organized. Alara worked the ranch, her movements mechanical, her mind elsewhere. On the morning of the deadline, a telegraph arrived. Rhett read it twice, then handed it to Ashford, who read it once and smiled grimly. "What does it say?" Alara asked, unable to read the tension in their faces. Rhett looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Sterling wants to negotiate. In person. He's coming here." "Here? To the ranch?" "Tomorrow morning." Rhett's eyes hardened. "He wants to talk terms directly. No lawyers, no intermediaries, just him and me." Alara's heart raced. "That could be dangerous." "It's smart," Ashford interjected. "He's trying to assess our resolve, see if we're bluffing." "We're not bluffing," Rhett said. "No," Ashford agreed, "but he doesn't know that yet. This meeting will determine whether we fight or settle." Alara looked between them, understanding the stakes. Tomorrow, the man who'd stolen everything from her would stand in Rhett's study. The man whose fraud had destroyed her life, who'd taken not just land but her daughter's grave, would try to negotiate his way out of consequences. "I want to be there," Alara said. No, Rhett said immediately. It's my farm, my fight. Exactly, which means you're too close. If you're in that room, Sterling will use it against us. Play on your emotions, try to make you settle for less than you deserve. Rhett's voice softened slightly. Trust me to handle this, please. Alara wanted to argue, wanted to demand her right to face her enemy, but she saw the logic in Rhett's reasoning. She also saw something else in his eyes, a promise. He would fight for her as fiercely as if the land were his own. All right, she said finally, but I want to know everything he says. Everything. You will, Rhett promised. That night, neither of them slept well. Rhett sat in his study, reviewing every document, every piece of evidence, preparing for every argument Sterling might make. Alara stood outside the cabin, staring at stars that seemed impossibly distant, and wondered if justice was really possible or if she was being a fool to hope. Morning came cold and clear. At 10 o'clock, a carriage arrived, expensive, well-maintained, pulled by matched horses. The man who stepped out was exactly what Alara had imagined, and nothing like it. Marcus Sterling was average height, average build, with thinning hair and a forgettable face. He looked like a bank clerk, not a predator. But his eyes were sharp, calculating, missing nothing as they swept across the ranch buildings, assessing value, cataloging assets. This was a man who saw the world as inventory. Rhett met him on the porch, offering no greeting, no handshake, just cold assessment. Mr. Sterling, Rhett said, you're on time. Mr. Calder. Sterling's voice was smooth, practiced. Thank you for agreeing to meet. I didn't agree to anything except listening. Come inside. In the study, Sterling settled into the chair across from Rhett's desk, entirely at ease despite being on hostile ground. Ashford stood to the side, observing, documenting. I'll be direct, Sterling began. I believe there's been a misunderstanding regarding the Voss property. No misunderstanding, Rhett said. Your company committed fraud. We have proof. You have allegations. Not the same thing. Sterling pulled out his own documents. I've reviewed the file. The foreclosure was handled properly. Mrs. Voss defaulted on her payments. We followed legal procedure. You forged her signature on the deed transfer. That's a serious accusation, one I'm confident you can't prove. Rhett slid a document across the desk, Alara's employment contract, signed just weeks ago. That's her real signature. Compare it to the one in your files. They're not even close. Sterling glanced at it, then away. Handwriting changes, especially under stress. Not that much, Ashford interjected. We've had it analyzed by a professional. The signature in your files is a forgery. That makes the entire transfer fraudulent. For the first time, something flickered in Sterling's eyes. Not fear, not yet, but awareness that this wasn't going as planned. Even if that were true, Sterling said carefully, Frontier Holdings purchased that debt in good faith. We're protected by law. You're protected if you were operating honestly, Rhett said. But you weren't. William Garrett was working on commission. Every property he brought in, he got 15%. That's not debt collection. That's bounty hunting. And it incentivized fraud. Sterling's jaw tightened slightly. Mr. Garrett's compensation structure was standard industry practice. Standard practice to incentivize theft? Rhett leaned forward. We've identified 12 other properties acquired the same way, same pattern, same methods, same fraud. That's not isolated mistakes. That's systematic criminal enterprise. The room went quiet. Sterling stared at Rhett, reassessing. This wasn't a small rancher who'd gotten lucky with evidence. This was someone who'd done deep research, found patterns, built a case that could destroy everything. What do you want? Sterling asked finally. The Voss property. Returned immediately. Clear title. No conditions. That's impossible. The property has value. We've invested resources. You stole it, Rhett interrupted, his voice dropping to something deadly quiet. Now you're going to return it. Or I'm going to make sure everyone knows what Frontier Holdings really is. Every newspaper in 3 territories will run the story. Every victim will be identified. Every forged document will be published. Your investors will run, your partners will scatter, and you'll be lucky if prison is the worst thing that happens to you. Sterling's hands clenched on the arms of his chair. You're threatening me. I'm promising you, Rhett corrected. This is your one chance to walk away with anything. Take it. The silence stretched, taut as wire. Sterling's mind was clearly racing, calculating odds, weighing options. Finally, he spoke. I need time. To arrange the transfer to... You have 1 week, Rhett said. 7 days to file the necessary documents, clear the title, and transfer ownership back to Alara Voss. If you do that, we'll keep the evidence private. No charges, no publicity, no pursuit. But if you miss the deadline or try to cheat us again, all of this becomes public immediately. Sterling stood slowly, his composure cracking around the edges. You're making a mistake. You don't know who you're dealing with. Yes, I do, Rhett said, standing to match him. I'm dealing with a thief and a coward who preys on people who can't fight back. Well, now you've found someone who can. Get out of my house. Sterling left without another word, his expensive carriage disappearing down the road in a cloud of dust and defeat. When he was gone, Ashford exhaled slowly. That was either brilliant or incredibly reckless. Both, Rhett agreed. Question is, will he do it? He'll do it, Ashford said with certainty. He's a businessman, not a fighter. You showed him that fighting costs more than surrendering. He'll take the deal. Rhett hoped he was right, but he prepared as if he was wrong. 7 days felt like 7 years. Alara couldn't stay still. She worked the fences until her hands bled through her gloves, checked water sources that didn't need checking, rode the boundary lines until Rhett's foreman Jackson started asking questions about her relentless patrols. She couldn't explain that motion was the only thing keeping her from breaking apart, that if she stopped moving she'd have to feel the terrible weight of hope pressing down on her chest. Hope was dangerous. Hope could kill you worse than despair ever could. Rhett watched her from a distance, understanding more than she realized. He'd felt that same desperate energy after his father died, that need to exhaust yourself so completely that sleep came without dreams. But he also knew that this wasn't just about waiting. This was about the possibility that everything could still fall apart. Sterling could disappear. The documents could vanish. Some technicality could emerge that made the whole agreement worthless. The powerful had 1,000 ways to escape consequences, and Rhett had given Sterling 7 days to find one. On the 3rd day, Ashford received a telegraph from his contact in Denver. Frontier Holdings had filed for bankruptcy protection. The company was collapsing, creditors circling like vultures, investors demanding answers. Sterling was trying to liquidate assets before the whole operation was seized by the courts. Does that help us or hurt us? Rhett asked, reading the telegram in his study while afternoon light slanted through the windows. Both, Ashford said, settling into the chair across from him. It means Sterling's desperate, which makes him unpredictable, but it also means he has every reason to settle quickly. If the court sees Frontier Holdings' assets before he transfers the Voss property, it becomes part of the bankruptcy estate. He loses all control. So he needs us as much as we need him. Maybe more, Ashford agreed. The question is whether he's smart enough to see that. Rhett folded the telegram, his mind already moving through contingencies. If he doesn't transfer the property by the deadline, we go public immediately. Full exposure. I want every newspaper in the territory ready to print. Already arranged, Ashford confirmed. I have reporters standing by in Denver, Santa Fe, and Cheyenne. They're hungry for a story like this. Corruption, fraud, vulnerable victims. One word from us and it runs everywhere. Good. Rhett stood, walking to the window. Outside, he could see Alara working near the barn, her movements sharp and focused. She doesn't know about the bankruptcy. You going to tell her? Not yet. She's barely holding together as it is. If she thinks this might fall through because of legal complications. Rhett shook his head. Let her have hope a little longer. And if it does fall through? Rhett's jaw set hard. Then we find another way. I'm not letting Sterling win. That evening, Rhett found Alara in the barn, brushing down one of the workhorses with methodical strokes. The animal stood patient and calm, clearly used to her touch. She didn't look up when Rhett approached, but her shoulders tensed slightly. You're going to wear a hole in that horse's coat, Rhett said quietly. He doesn't mind. Alara's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as they moved the brush. Helps me think. About? Whether I'm being a fool. She finally looked at him, and her eyes were raw with something between fear and fury. Whether I'm letting myself believe in something impossible just because I want it so badly. Rhett leaned against the stall door, understanding the question beneath the question. She wasn't asking about the property. She was asking if he'd made promises he couldn't keep. I don't make promises I can't keep, Rhett said. You'll get your land back, one way or another. You can't guarantee that. No, Rhett admitted. But I can guarantee I won't stop trying until you do. Alara set down the brush, turning to face him fully. In the dim barn light, her face showed every year of hardship she'd endured, every loss she'd survived. Why does it matter so much to you? It's just land, just one farm. You have thousands of acres. What's 200 more? It's not about the acres, Rhett said. It's about what they represent. Which is? The belief that strength matters more than right, that power trumps justice, that people like Sterling can take whatever they want from people like you and face no consequences. Rhett's voice hardened. I've seen that my whole life. I've watched good people get crushed by bad systems, and I'm tired of it. So I'm a symbol? Alara's tone carried an edge. A way for you to fight your own battles? No, Rhett met her eyes directly. You're a person who got robbed and deserves what's yours. But I won't pretend this isn't personal for me, too. My father died fighting people like Sterling. I couldn't help him. Maybe I can't change the past, but I can damn well do something about the present. The honesty of it hit Alara like a physical force. She'd expected platitudes or noble lies. Instead, Rhett had given her raw truth, his own pain, his own failures, his own desperate need for this to mean something. I'm scared, Alara admitted quietly. I'm scared that I'll get the farm back and it won't feel like I thought it would, that it won't fix anything. It won't, Rhett said bluntly. Getting your land back won't bring your daughter back. Won't erase the years you lost, won't undo what Sterling did to you. Then why fight for it? Because justice matters even when it doesn't heal everything. Because theft should have consequences even when returning what was stolen can't restore what was lost. Rhett pushed off from the stall door. And because sometimes winning isn't about feeling better, it's about refusing to let the bastards get away with it. Alara laughed, a short, sharp sound that was half sob. You're a hard man, Rhett called her. So I've been told, but a good one. She picked up the brush again, returning to the horse. Thank you for all of this. Thank me when it's done, Rhett said, and left her to her thoughts. The fourth day brought rain, cold, driving sheets that turned the ranch roads to mud and made every task twice as hard. Alara worked through it anyway, refusing shelter, refusing rest. The physical discomfort was easier than the mental anguish of waiting. The fifth day brought worse news. Another telegraph from Ashford's contact. Sterling had been spotted in meetings with territorial judges, including Judge Harrison Blackwell, known for his flexible interpretation of law when properly incentivized. If Sterling was trying to get legal protection before the deadline, it meant he was planning to fight rather than settle. This time, Rhett told Alara. They sat in his study while rain hammered the windows, the documents spread between them like evidence at a trial. Alara read the telegraph 3 times, her face going paler with each reading. He's trying to get the court to block the transfer, she said finally. Even if we have proof of fraud, if a judge rules that the bankruptcy takes precedence, then the property gets tied up in legal proceedings for years, Rhett finished, and you never see it again. So we've lost. No. Rhett's voice cut through her despair like a blade through fog. We've just learned what he's planning. That means we can counter it. How? You can't bribe a judge. You won't do that. You're right, I won't. Rhett stood, pacing the study with controlled energy. But I can do something better. I can make it politically impossible for Blackwell to rule in Sterling's favor. What does that mean? It means we go public now, before the deadline, before Sterling can get his legal protection in place. Rhett turned to her, his eyes blazing with cold fire. We tell the story, your story, to every newspaper that will print it. We name Sterling, name Frontier Holdings, name every property they stole. We make it so loud, so public, that no judge can ignore it without destroying his own reputation. Alara's breath caught. That's risky. If we go public and he still wins somehow, I'll have nothing left. No privacy, no dignity, nothing. I know, Rhett said quietly. That's why I'm asking instead of deciding for you. This is your story, your pain, your choice whether to share it with the world. The weight of the decision pressed down on Alara like a physical thing. To tell her story meant exposing everything: the loss of her daughter, the theft of her land, the years of desperate survival. It meant standing naked before the judgment of strangers, inviting their pity or their doubt or their blame. But it also meant fighting back with the only weapon she had left: truth. "Do it," Alara said. "Tell them everything." Rhett nodded once, then began drafting telegraphs to every contact Ashford had cultivated. By midnight, the story was moving across wire lines to newsrooms in 3 territories. By morning, reporters would have enough detail to run with it, and by the time Sterling realized what was happening, it would be too late to stop. The 6th day exploded. The Denver Post ran the story on page 1. Frontier Holdings accused of systematic fraud, widows' land stolen through forged documents. The article laid out everything: Alara's story, the evidence of forgery, the pattern of similar thefts, Sterling's attempt to liquidate assets before bankruptcy proceedings could seize them. The reporter, a bulldog named Catherine Wells, who'd made her reputation exposing corruption, had done exactly what Rhett hoped she would: dug deeper, found more victims, turned a single case into a scandal. By afternoon, 3 other papers had picked up the story. By evening, telegraphs were flooding in from other victims, families who'd lost land to Frontier Holdings and thought they were alone, that no one would believe them, that the system was rigged too completely to fight. They weren't alone anymore. Rhett read the messages aloud to Alara and Ashford, his voice steady even as the sheer scope of Sterling's crimes became clear. 37 properties. 37 families robbed through the same methods: friendly approach, debt transfer, manufactured default, foreclosure. 37 stolen futures. "This is bigger than we thought," Ashford said, his face grim. "This isn't just fraud, this is organized crime." "Can we use it?" Rhett asked. "Use it?" Ashford laughed sharply. "Rhett, this is dynamite. With this many victims coming forward, with this much publicity, Sterling can't make this go away. Neither can Blackwell. If the judge rules in Sterling's favor now, he'll be committing political suicide." Alara sat silent through all of this, staring at the pile of telegraphs from people she'd never met, but whose stories mirrored her own. "They all lost everything," she said quietly. "Just like me." "Yes," Rhett said, "and now they have a chance to get it back, because you were willing to fight." "I didn't do anything. You did this." "I opened doors," Rhett corrected, "but you walked through them. You were the one brave enough to stay in that cabin, to accept impossible terms, to trust that maybe this time justice was possible. They're coming forward because you went first." The words hung in the air between them, carrying weight Alara hadn't expected. She'd thought of herself as powerless for so long that the idea of her actions inspiring others felt foreign, impossible. But the evidence was there in the telegraphs, in the newspaper articles, in the growing wave of people finding their voices because she'd found hers. That night, Rhett received an urgent message from Ashford. Judge Blackwell had recused himself from any cases involving Frontier Holdings, citing the media attention and potential conflict of interest. Without judicial protection, Sterling had no legal shield. The tide was turning. The 7th day arrived with crystalline clarity. No clouds, no wind, just sharp blue sky and air so cold it burned the lungs. Alara stood outside the cabin at dawn, watching the sun rise over land that might, finally, impossibly, be hers again. Rhett found her there an hour later, 2 horses saddled and ready. "Come on," he said. "We're going to town." "Why?" "Because today's the deadline, and I want to be there when Sterling delivers the documents. Or doesn't." They rode in silence, the horses' breath forming clouds in the frozen air. The town of Redemption Gap came into view gradually, a collection of wood and stone buildings huddled in a valley, defiant against the wilderness surrounding it. The land office sat on Main Street, its windows reflecting the morning sun. Ashford was already there, waiting on the steps with his leather case and the expression of a man preparing for battle. "No sign of Sterling yet," he reported, "but the day's young." "He'll come," Rhett said with certainty. "He has no choice now." They waited inside, Morrison the clerk watching nervously from behind his counter. The old man had read the newspapers, understood that his office was about to become the stage for either justice or its final denial. 9 o'clock came and went. 10 o'clock. 11. Alara's hands clenched and unclenched in her lap, her breathing shallow. He's not coming. He'll come, Rhett repeated, though his own jaw was tight with tension. At 11:30, the door opened. But it wasn't Sterling who entered. It was William Garrett, the man who'd stolen Alara's farm with kind words and false promises. He looked diminished somehow, smaller than Alara remembered, his expensive suit rumpled and his face haggard. Alara stood abruptly, her chair scraping back. You! Garrett flinched at the recognition. Mrs. Voss, I came to deliver these. He held out a leather folder with shaking hands. Ashford took it, opening it carefully. Inside were documents. Official, stamped, legal. A quitclaim deed transferring the Voss property from Frontier Holdings back to Alara Voss. An affidavit admitting the original foreclosure was based on fraudulent documentation. A statement from Marcus Sterling resigning from Frontier Holdings and acknowledging wrongdoing. Everything they'd demanded, everything and more. Where's Sterling? Rhett asked. Garrett's laugh was bitter and broken. Gone. Left Denver 3 days ago, once he realized the game was over. He sent me to clean up his mess. He looked at Alara, his eyes hollow. I'm sorry. For what I did. For all of it. I told myself I was just doing business, following orders. But I knew. I knew what we were doing to people, and I did it anyway because the money was good, and I didn't have to look at the consequences. Save your confession, Alara said, her voice ice. You took everything from me. An apology doesn't give that back. I know. Garrett's shoulders slumped. I know it doesn't, but the property is yours again, legal and clear. That's something. Ashford was already reviewing the documents with practiced speed, checking every clause, every signature, every stamp. After 5 minutes of intense scrutiny, he looked up and nodded to Rhett. It's legitimate, Ashford confirmed. Full transfer of title, no encumbrances, no conditions. The land is hers. The words seemed to suck all the air from the room. Alara stood frozen, unable to process what she'd just heard. 4 years of loss, of wandering, of desperate survival, and now, in an instant, it was over. The land was hers again. Morrison stepped forward, his clerk's instincts taking over. I'll need to record these documents. Make it official in the county records. Do it now, Rhett said. I want this filed before anything can go wrong. While Morrison worked, Garrett stood uncertainly in the corner, clearly wanting to leave but not quite daring to. Alara ignored him, her attention fixed on the documents as Morrison carefully copied information into the massive ledger books that served as the county's official record. Finally, Morrison looked up. It's done. Recorded as of today, March 23rd, 1885. The property legally belongs to Alara Voss. Alara swayed slightly, and Rhett caught her elbow, steadying her. You all right? I don't know, Alara said honestly. I thought I'd feel different, triumphant or relieved or something, but I just feel empty. That's normal, Rhett said quietly. You've been fighting for so long that when the fight ends, you don't know what to do with yourself. Give it time. Garrett cleared his throat. Mrs. Voss, I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I wanted you to know. I'm cooperating with the territorial investigation. They're going after everyone involved with Frontier Holdings. I've given them names, documents, everything. It won't undo what happened, but maybe it'll prevent it from happening to others. Is that supposed to make me forgive you? Alara asked. No, Garrett said. Nothing could do that. I just wanted you to know that your fight, what you and Mr. Calder did, it's bigger than just your property. You've brought down an entire criminal operation. That matters. Before Alara could respond, Garrett turned and left, the door closing behind him with quiet finality. Ashford gathered the documents, placing them carefully in his case. I'll file copies with the territorial office as well. Redundancy in case Morrison's records are ever questioned, and I'll make sure the newspaper runs a follow-up story. Frontier Holdings defeated, property restored, justice served. It'll cement the narrative. Good, Rhett said. He turned to Alara. You want to see it? The farm. Alara's breath caught. She hadn't been back since the day the sheriff escorted her off her own land. The thought of returning, of seeing the house she'd built with her husband, the fields where her daughter had played, the small grave under the oak tree. It was almost more than she could bear, but she nodded. Yes, I need to see it. They rode out that afternoon, leaving Ashford to handle the legal formalities. The journey took 3 hours, following roads Alara had once known by heart, but had forced herself to forget. Every mile brought memories flooding back, good and terrible, joyful and crushing. When they finally crested the hill overlooking the farm, Alara stopped her horse so abruptly it danced sideways in confusion. The farm looked abandoned. The house still stood, but windows were broken, the porch sagged, and weeds had reclaimed the vegetable garden. The barn door hung crooked on broken hinges. The fences were down in places, posts rotted and wire tangled. 4 years of neglect had turned her home into a ghost of itself. Frontier Holdings never did anything with it, Red observed, scanning the property with a rancher's practiced eye. Probably planned to flip it quickly, but couldn't find a buyer. So it just sat here rotting. Alara dismounted slowly, her legs unsteady. She walked toward this house like someone approaching a grave, each step heavy with the weight of memory. The front door was unlocked, or more accurately, the lock was broken. Inside, dust covered everything. The furniture she and her husband had built was still there, but mice had nested in the upholstery and water damage had warped the table. The walls still bore marks where her daughter's height had been measured year by year, the line stopping abruptly at the mark labeled Sophie, 6 years. Laura traced those marks with shaking fingers, and for the first time since entering the land office, she felt something break inside her chest. Not despair, not quite grief, something else, a release maybe, of 4 years of holding everything too tightly. She cried. Not quiet tears, but great wrenching sobs that doubled her over, made her knees give way, left her kneeling on the dusty floor of her reclaimed home. She cried for her daughter, for her husband, for the life that should have been and never would be. She cried for the years stolen from her, for the home destroyed through malice and greed, for the woman she'd been before loss taught her how to survive. Rhett stood in the doorway, giving her space but not leaving. He understood that some grief needed witnesses, even when it couldn't be shared. When the storm finally passed, Alara sat back on her heels, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "I'm sorry," she said hoarsely. "Don't be. The house is a disaster. The land probably is too. It'll take years to rebuild all this." "Yes," Red agreed. "But you have years now, and you won't be doing it alone." Alara looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I'm not letting you struggle through this the way you struggled before." Rhett stepped into the house, his boots leaving prints in the dust. "You work for me. That means you have resources now. Access to materials, labor, equipment. We'll rebuild this place properly." "I can't afford. Consider it a loan against future earnings," Rhett interrupted. "You pay it back over time, at terms you can actually manage. No tricks, no fraud, no manufactured defaults. Just an honest agreement between people who trust each other." The word trust hit Alara like a revelation. She hadn't trusted anyone in 4 years, hadn't dared to. But Rhett had earned it. Through actions, through follow-through, through keeping every promise he'd made. "Why are you doing this?" she asked again, needing to understand. "Because this is what we fought for," Rhett said simply. "Not just to get your land back, but to give you a real chance to rebuild your life. Justice without opportunity is just paperwork. I want more than paperwork for you." Alara stood slowly, looking around the damaged house with new eyes. It was a wreck now, yes, but it was her wreck, her land, her future, whatever she chose to make of it. "All right," she said. "Let's rebuild." They walked the property together as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The fields would need replowing, the fences complete reconstruction, the barn serious structural repair. But the land itself was good, rich soil, reliable water source, protected from the worst weather by surrounding hills. It could be a farm again, a real one. When they reached the far corner of the property, Alara stopped at a small oak tree. Beneath it, almost hidden by tall grass, was a simple wooden marker. The paint had faded, but the carved letters were still visible. Sophie Voss, beloved daughter. Alara knelt beside the grave, pulling weeds away from the marker with gentle hands. "I'm back, baby," she whispered. "I'm finally back." Rhett stood back, giving her privacy for this reunion. He thought about his own father, buried on Calder land, and understood that some returns were about more than property. They were about being able to honor the dead in the places they belonged. As darkness fell, they rode back toward Rhett's ranch in comfortable silence. Alara was exhausted, emotionally, physically, spiritually, but underneath the exhaustion was something she'd almost forgotten how to feel. Peace. Not happiness, not yet, but the deep bone-level peace of knowing that what was hers was truly hers again, that the fight was over and she'd won. That night, in the main house, Rhett pulled out a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for something important. He poured 2 glasses, handing one to Alara. "To justice," he said, raising his glass. "To justice," Alara echoed. They drank, the whiskey burning warm and clean. Ashford arrived the next morning with more news. The territorial investigation into Frontier Holdings had resulted in criminal charges against Sterling, fraud, forgery, theft by deception. Warrants had been issued. Federal marshals were searching for him across 3 territories. More importantly, the investigation had uncovered documents showing that 30 of the 37 stolen properties could be returned to their original owners using the same legal strategy that had worked for Alara. Families who'd given up hope were getting second chances. "You started something," Ashford told Alara over breakfast. "One woman refusing to accept theft as inevitable. That's all it took to bring down an entire criminal enterprise." "One woman and one very stubborn rancher," Alara corrected, glancing at Rhett. "True enough," Ashford agreed, "but the point stands. You fought when fighting seemed impossible. Others saw that and found their own courage." The weight of that responsibility settled over Alara. The knowledge that her pain made public had become a weapon that freed others. It didn't erase what she'd lost. Nothing could do that. But it meant her suffering had led to something beyond itself. That had to count for something. Over the following weeks, Rhett made good on his promise. Ranch hands were dispatched to the Voss property with lumber, tools, and instructions to begin repairs. Alara supervised the work, her knowledge of the land and buildings proving invaluable. Slowly, painstakingly, the farm began to transform from ruin back to possibility. The house got a new roof, new windows, reinforced foundation. The barn was rebuilt from the ground up, stronger than before. Fences went up straight and true, using techniques Alara had learned working Rhett's western section. The fields were plowed and prepared for spring planting, and through it all, Alara worked alongside the hired help, refusing to let anyone else shoulder the burden of rebuilding what was hers. Rhett visited regularly, ostensibly to check on progress, but really to make sure Alara wasn't pushing herself to collapse. He found her resilient in ways that surprised him, not just physically strong, which he'd known for months, but emotionally steady. She'd found purpose in reconstruction, healing in the act of creation. One evening, as they sat on the newly rebuilt porch watching the sun set over fields that would soon hold crops again, Alara spoke the question that had been building in her for weeks. "What happens now?" she asked. "Between us, I mean. I have my land back. I can support myself. I don't need to work for you anymore." Rhett was quiet for a long moment, considering. They'd built something through these months of fighting side by side, respect, certainly, understanding, maybe something more that neither of them had wanted to name. "You could walk away," Rhett said finally. "Build this farm, live your life, we'd be neighbors and nothing more. Is that what you want?" "No," Rhett admitted, "but it's not about what I want. It's about what's right for you." Alara turned to look at him fully. This man who'd given her back her future and was now offering to let her go. "What if I don't want to walk away?" "Then don't," Rhett said simply. "Keep working for me, not because you owe me or because you're desperate, because you're damn good at it, and I need someone I can trust running that western section." "Just business, then? Is that what you want it to be?" The question hung between them, heavy with possibility and risk. Alara had sworn after her husband died that she'd never depend on anyone again, never let herself be vulnerable to that kind of loss. But Rhett wasn't asking for dependence. He was offering partnership, honest, equal, built on proven trust. "I don't know what I want," Alara said honestly. "I'm still figuring out who I am now that I'm not running anymore." "Fair enough," Rhett said. "Take your time. The offer stands either way." They sat together in the gathering darkness. Two people who'd fought their way from distrust to alliance to something neither could quite name. The future stretched before them, uncertain but no longer hopeless. And for the first time in 4 years, Alara Voss could imagine possibilities beyond mere survival. Spring arrived with the violence that matched the winter's cruelty. Snow melted in torrents, turning streams into rivers and roads into impassable mud. The land transformed almost overnight from frozen white to vibrant green, as if nature itself was celebrating survival. Alara stood in her fields, watching the first shoots of wheat break through soil she'd prepared with her own hands. Real crops, a real future. The impossibility of it still caught her breath sometimes. That this land was truly hers, that no one could take it, that the papers filed in Morrison's office were genuine and permanent. But peace, she was learning, came with its own complications. The other victims of Frontier Holdings had started reaching out. Letters arrived weekly, sometimes daily, from families whose properties were being restored through the legal framework Ashford and Rhett had established. They wrote with gratitude, with questions, with requests for advice. Some wanted to know how to rebuild. Others wanted to share their own stories of loss and recovery. Alara read every letter, answered most of them. But the weight of being a symbol, of representing something larger than herself, pressed down with unexpected heaviness. "You don't owe them anything beyond what you've already done," Rhett said one evening, finding her at her kitchen table surrounded by correspondence. He'd started visiting more frequently, ostensibly to check on the farm's progress, but really because the pattern of it had become comfortable, necessary even. "I know," Alara said, setting down a letter from a widow in New Mexico whose farm had been stolen through the same method Sterling used. "But if I don't answer, if I don't help where I can, then what was the point of going public? I made their pain part of my story. The least I can do is acknowledge it." "The point was getting your land back," Rhett countered. "Everything else is consequence, not obligation." "Maybe." Alara rubbed her eyes, tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor. "But sometimes consequences become obligations whether we choose them or not." Rhett understood that better than she knew. His own fight against Sterling had created ripples he hadn't fully anticipated. Other ranchers had started asking him for help with their own land disputes, assuming his success with Alara's case meant he had some secret knowledge or special influence. The territorial governor had written personally, thanking him for exposing corruption and hinting strongly that Rhett should consider public office. He'd ignored that last part completely. "There's something else bothering you," Rhett observed, reading the tension in Alara's shoulders, the way her hands clenched around the letters. Alara was quiet for a long moment, then pulled a specific letter from the pile. "This came yesterday, from a reporter in Denver. She wants to write a book about the Frontier Holdings case. About me. My story." "Catherine Wells?" "Yes. She says it would help other victims, that documenting what happened would create a record that could prevent future fraud." Alara looked up at him. "She wants details about Sophie, about my husband, about the years I spent wandering. Everything." "What did you tell her?" "Nothing yet. I wanted to think about it first." Alara set the letter down carefully, as if it might detonate. "Part of me wants to do it, to make sure what Sterling did is never forgotten, that people understand the human cost of that kind of theft. But another part wants to keep your pain private," Rhett finished, "wants to rebuild in peace without being defined by what you lost." "Yes." The relief in Alara's voice was palpable, relief at being understood without having to explain. "Is that selfish?" "No," Rhett said firmly. "It's human. You've given enough. If you want to say no, say no. But if the book could help others, then someone else can write it. Someone else can be the example." Rhett leaned forward, his gray eyes intense. "You don't have to be everyone's symbol of survival. You're allowed to just be Alara Voss trying to rebuild her farm and her life. That's enough." The permission to choose herself, to prioritize her own healing over public good, felt revolutionary. Alara had spent so long in survival mode, doing whatever was necessary, accepting any terms, sacrificing privacy for justice, that she'd forgotten she could say no. "I'll write to Wells," Alara decided. "Tell her I appreciate the offer, but I'm not ready. Maybe someday. But not now." "Good," Rhett said. Then, after a pause, "Though I understand if you change your mind. Whatever you decide, I'll support it."
Kanantans.
The conversation shifted to easier topics. planting schedules, livestock considerations, whether Alara should focus on crops or consider raising cattle. They talked until darkness fell and the oil lamps burned low, and Rhett finally stood to leave. At the door, he paused. Alara? Yes? You're doing well, with all of this. Better than most people would. I'm surviving, Alara corrected. There's a difference. No, Rhett said quietly. You're living. There's a difference. After he left, Alara sat alone in her rebuilt kitchen, letting the words settle into her bones. Living, not just surviving. When had that shift happened? When had she stopped simply enduring each day and started actually building toward something? She couldn't pinpoint the exact moment. Maybe it had been gradual, each fence post driven, each board nailed, each decision made about her future rather than just her immediate survival. Or maybe it had been that day in the land office when Morrison recorded her name in the ledger as the property's rightful owner. Either way, Rhett was right. She was living again, and that was terrifying in ways survival never had been. The next morning brought visitors. 3 of them, dusty from hard travel, their horses tired and their faces etched with the particular exhaustion that came from long-carried hope, finally approaching resolution. Mrs. Voss? The oldest one called out as Alara emerged from the barn. My name is Thomas Brennan. This is my son James and my daughter-in-law Sarah. We're from outside Santa Fe. We lost our land to Frontier Holdings 2 years ago. Alara's stomach dropped. She'd known this might happen, that restored victims would seek her out, wanting to share their stories or ask for guidance. But knowing and experiencing were different things. I'm sorry for what happened to you, Alara said carefully, but I'm not sure how I can help. My case was handled by lawyers, by Mr. Calder's resources. We're getting our land back, Thomas interrupted, his weathered face breaking into a smile that looked unpracticed, as if he'd forgotten how. The territorial investigation found our case, used the same evidence pattern that worked for you. We just got the deed transferred last week. Relief flooded through Alara. That's wonderful. I'm happy for you. We came to thank you, Sarah said, stepping forward. She was young, maybe 25, with eyes that had seen too much hardship. And to ask, how do you do it? How do you start over after everything's been taken? The question hung in the morning air, heavy with genuine need. These people had their land back, just as Alara did, but land alone didn't heal the wounds of theft and loss. It didn't automatically restore the person you'd been before. Come inside, Alara said, making a decision. I'll make coffee. They sat around her kitchen table, the same table she and her husband had built, that had survived Sterling's neglect through sheer sturdy construction. Alara poured coffee and listened as the Brennans told their story. It was painfully familiar, friendly representative, debt transfer, manufactured default, sudden foreclosure. They'd lost not just land, but savings, possessions, years of work. How do you not hate them every second? James asked, his hands wrapped tight around his coffee cup. How do you not let that poison everything? Alara considered the question honestly. I do hate them, she admitted. Sterling, Garrett, everyone who participated. The hate doesn't go away just because I got my land back, but I try not to let it be the biggest thing in my life. I try to make rebuilding bigger than the hate. Does it work? Sarah asked. Sometimes, Alara said. Other times the hate wins and I spend the whole day angry at ghosts, but those days get fewer as time passes. They talked for hours. Alara shared practical advice. How to prioritize repairs, where to find affordable materials, which crops offered the best return for limited resources. But she also shared the harder truths, that justice didn't erase trauma, that reclaiming what was stolen didn't automatically restore who you'd been before, that healing was slower and more complicated than anyone wanted it to be. When the Brennans finally left, riding toward their own reclaimed future, Alara felt drained but also strangely lighter. Maybe there was value in sharing the struggle, in making sure others knew they weren't alone in the complicated mess of recovery. That evening, she rode to Rhett's ranch, finding him in the study as always, surrounded by ledgers and maps. The Brennans came to see me, she said without preamble. Rhett looked up, concern flickering across his face. You all right? Yes. Actually, yes. Alara settled into the chair across from him. They wanted to thank me, to ask how to rebuild. And I realized something while talking to them. What? That maybe I do have an obligation to the others, not to Wells and her book, not to be some public symbol, but to the people who are going through exactly what I went through, to share what I've learned, to let them know the hard parts so they're not blindsided. Rhett set down his pen, giving her his full attention. That's a lot to take on. I know, but I think I need to do it anyway, not out of guilt or duty, but because Alara struggled for the right words. Because isolation made everything harder. If I'd had someone to talk to who understood, who'd survived the same thing, maybe it wouldn't have felt so impossible. So you want to be that person for others. If I can be. On my terms, at my pace. Not through newspapers or books, but directly. Person to person. Rhett considered this, his sharp mind already working through implications. You'd need help, resources, a way to connect with the people who need you without being overwhelmed. I was hoping you'd say that, Alara admitted. I'm not asking you to run it or fund it, but maybe advice, connections, whatever you're willing to offer. I'll do better than that, Rhett said. I'll help you build it properly. A network. Informal, private, just victims helping victims. Ashford can handle the legal structure, make sure it's protected. You can focus on the actual help. Why? Alara asked. Why keep helping when you've already done so much? Rhett's expression shifted to something vulnerable, almost uncertain. Because watching you rebuild, watching you find purpose beyond survival, it's reminded me why I care about this land, this life, any of it. You fight like it matters. Like every fence post, every crop, every small victory is worth the effort. I'd forgotten that. I'd let everything become just management, systems, and efficiency. And now? Now I remember that it's supposed to mean something. Rhett stood, walking to the window. My father died fighting for land that mattered to him. I inherited it, expanded it, made it profitable. But somewhere along the way, I forgot to make it matter beyond the numbers in these ledgers. You reminded me. The honesty of it struck Alara silent. She'd thought she was the only one being transformed by their partnership, the only one learning how to live instead of just survive. But Rhett had been changing too, rediscovering purpose he'd lost to grief and isolated self-sufficiency. So we help each other, Alara said quietly. You help me build something that matters. I help you remember why your land matters. Deal, Rhett said. Over the following weeks, they built the framework for what would become known, quietly, among those who needed it, as the Recovery Network. Nothing official, no public announcements, just a carefully maintained list of people who'd lost land to fraud and gotten it back. Alara wrote to each one personally, offering support, advice, and connection to others in similar situations. The responses were overwhelming. Letters poured in, not just from Frontier Holdings victims, but from others who'd lost property to different schemes, different criminals. People who'd been isolated in their suffering found community. People who'd thought they were alone discovered dozens facing identical struggles. Alara coordinated it all from her kitchen table, sorting correspondence into categories, connecting people with similar situations, providing resources where she could. It was exhausting work, often heartbreaking, but also deeply fulfilling in ways she hadn't anticipated. Rhett helped behind the scenes, funding travel for victims who needed to testify in legal proceedings, providing employment for those struggling financially during rebuilding, using his territorial connections to expedite property transfers that were tangled in bureaucracy. He never took credit, never made it public. Just quiet, effective support that made real difference. Jackson, Rhett's foreman, noticed the change in his boss. You seem different lately, he observed one day while they worked on the northern fence line. Lighter, somehow. Do I? Rhett replied noncommittally. You do. It's the widow, isn't it? The one you helped get her farm back. Rhett's jaw tightened slightly. Mrs. Voss is a colleague and a friend. Nothing more. If you say so, Jackson said, clearly not believing it. But I've worked for you 10 years, and I've never seen you ride out to check on anyone's property as often as you check on hers. She's rebuilding a complex operation with limited resources. It requires oversight. That what we're calling it? Jackson's grin was knowing, but not unkind. Boss, I'm not judging. That woman's got steel in her spine and sense in her head. You could do a hell of a lot worse. I'm not doing anything. Rhett said firmly. We're partners in a project, that's all. But Jackson's words lingered, uncomfortable because they touched on truth Rhett had been avoiding. His feelings for Alara had evolved beyond respect, beyond friendship, into territory he'd sworn never to enter again after Margaret left. He'd told himself love required vulnerability he couldn't afford, trust he couldn't give, emotional availability he'd long since cauterized. Yet somehow, Alara had slipped past those defenses. Not through deliberate seduction or manipulation, but through simple, consistent presence. Through working beside him in blizzards. Through trusting him with her pain. Through proving that strength didn't require isolation, that partnership didn't mean weakness. He didn't know what to do with that realization. Alara, meanwhile, was wrestling with her own complicated feelings. She'd started looking forward to Rhett's visits with an intensity that had nothing to do with the recovery network or farm consultations. She noticed details she had no business noticing, the way his hands looked when he gestured while talking, the rare smile that softened his severe features, the calm competence with which he approached every problem. She told herself it was just gratitude, just appreciation for everything he'd done. But gratitude didn't explain why her pulse quickened when she heard his horse approaching, why she found herself choosing her words more carefully around him, why she lay awake some nights thinking about that moment on the porch, when he'd offered partnership and maybe something more. The situation came to a head on a sweltering July afternoon. Alara was working in her vegetable garden when storm clouds rolled in with terrifying speed, turning the sky black and the air electric. Lightning cracked, close enough to feel, and rain began falling in sheets that turned the world to water. She ran for the house but knew immediately she wouldn't make it. The barn was closer, so she sprinted there instead, arriving soaked and breathing hard just as hail started hammering the roof. She wasn't alone. Rhett stood just inside the barn door, equally drenched, having apparently had the same idea about shelter. They stared at each other for a moment, water dripping from hair and clothes, the storm raging outside with apocalyptic fury. Then they both started laughing, real laughter, the kind that came from the absurdity of life and the relief of shared survival. We have to stop meeting like this, Alara said, wringing water from her braid. In barns during storms? Rhett pulled off his soaked hat, shaking water from it. There are worse places. They settled on hay bales to wait out the storm, the barn dim and close, smelling of dry grass and summer heat. Outside, thunder rolled like artillery, and hail pounded the roof with relentless percussion. I've been thinking about something you said, Rhett began after a long silence. About living versus surviving. Yes? I realized I've been surviving for years. Maybe since my father died. Definitely since Margaret left. I built this empire, this reputation, but somewhere along the way, I forgot to actually live in it. He looked at her directly. You changed that. You made me remember there's a difference. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. Rhett, let me finish, he interrupted gently. I'm not good at this. At talking about feelings or being vulnerable or any of the things that normal people do easily. But you deserve honesty, so here it is. I care about you. More than I should, more than I plan to, more than is probably smart given everything you've been through. The words hung between them, brave and terrifying. I'm not asking for anything, Rhett continued. I know you're still rebuilding, still healing. I just needed you to know that whatever happens, whether you want to keep this as business partnership or friendship or nothing at all, I'm grateful you trusted me. That matters more than you know. Alara sat frozen, processing. Part of her wanted to retreat, to protect the fragile peace she'd built through emotional distance. But a larger part, the part that had learned to fight impossible fights and trust unlikely allies, wanted something different. I care about you too, she said quietly. And that terrifies me. After my husband died, I swore I'd never depend on anyone again, never risk that kind of loss. But you're making me reconsider what partnership could mean. I'm not asking you to depend on me, Rhett said. I'm asking if maybe we could depend on each other, share the burden instead of carrying it alone. That's the same thing. No, it's not. Depending on someone means they hold your weight. Depending on each other means we hold each other's weight. It's balanced, equal. Alara had never thought of it that way. Her marriage to her husband had been good, loving, but also traditional. He'd provided, she'd supported, their roles clearly defined. What Rhett was describing was something different. A partnership of equals, built on mutual respect and proven trust. I don't know if I'm ready, she admitted. I don't know if I'll ever be ready. That's fair, Rhett said. But if you ever are, I'm here. And if you're never ready, I'm still here. As your partner in the recovery network, as your neighbor, as your friend. Whatever you need. The unconditional nature of the offer broke something open in Alara's chest. This wasn't manipulation or pressure. It was simple, honest offering of support with no strings attached, no expectations, no demands for return. It was, she realized, the kind of love she'd thought existed only in stories. The storm began to ease, rain softening to steady rhythm instead of deluge. They sat together in the barn's dimness, not touching but present to each other in ways that went beyond physical proximity. Can I ask you something? Alara said finally. Anything. Why didn't you fight harder to keep Margaret? You clearly loved her. Why let her go? Rhett was quiet for a long moment, considering. Because she was miserable, he said finally. She hated this life, the isolation, the hardship, the fact that I couldn't be the husband she needed because the ranch demanded everything I had. I could have fought to keep her here, could have used guilt or obligation or love as weapons. But that wouldn't have made her happy. So I let her go. Do you regret it? I regret that I couldn't be what she needed, but I don't regret letting her find happiness elsewhere. Rhett looked at Alara steadily. Love shouldn't be a cage. If it requires someone to sacrifice who they are, it's not love. It's possession. Is that why you're not pushing me now? Because you don't want to possess me? I don't want to possess anyone, Rhett said. I want a partner who chooses to stay because this life fulfills them, not because they're trapped or obligated. That's worth waiting for. Alara felt tears prick her eyes. Not sad tears, but something more complex. Gratitude, wonder, and the fragile beginning of hope that maybe, possibly, she could have this. Could have partnership without losing herself, love without dependence, connection without vulnerability, becoming a weapon. Ask me again in a year, she said softly. Ask you what? If I'm ready. If I want what you're offering. Ask me when the farm's fully rebuilt, when I've had time to figure out who I am now. Then I'll give you a real answer. Rhett smiled, genuine and warm. 1 year. I'll ask you on July 15th, 1886. Is that a deal? Deal, Alara confirmed. They shook hands on it, the gesture formal and absurd given everything they'd just shared. But it felt right somehow. A contract between equals. A promise that time mattered and patience was worth it. The storm passed completely, leaving behind clean air and a world washed bright. They walked out of the barn together, surveying the damage. Some crop flattening, minor flooding, nothing catastrophic. Just another challenge to overcome. As Rhett mounted his horse to ride home, he paused. Alara? Yes? Thank you for trusting me with the truth. It means everything. Thank you for being worth trusting, she replied. He rode away and Alara stood in her field, watching him go. 1 year. 12 months to finish rebuilding, to solidify her independence, to become the person she wanted to be rather than just a survivor of what she'd lost. It felt like both an eternity and no time at all. But for the first time since her husband died, Alara let herself imagine a future that included partnership, maybe even love, not as a rescue or a salvation, but as a choice made freely by someone strong enough to stand alone but willing to consider standing together. That possibility, terrifying and thrilling in equal measure, was worth whatever time it took to get there. The year that followed was both the longest and shortest of Alara's life. Summer ripened into autumn, and her first crop came in. Not abundant, but sufficient. Real wheat from real fields that belonged to her without question or threat. She harvested it herself with help from 2 young men Rhett had sent over, workers who treated her with respect rather than pity, who took orders without resentment, who understood she was the boss of this operation. The grain sold for a fair price at the mill in Redemption Gap, and for the first time in years, Alara held money she'd earned through honest work on her own land. She paid Rhett back a portion of what she owed for materials, insisted on it despite his protests that it could wait. Debts should be honored, Alara said firmly, counting out bills in his study. You gave me terms I could manage. I'm managing them. Rhett accepted the payment with a nod that acknowledged more than the transaction. This was about dignity, about Alara proving to herself and to him that she could stand on her own feet financially. He understood that the money mattered less than what it represented. The recovery network grew beyond anything either of them had anticipated. What started as Alara writing letters from her kitchen table evolved into something more organized, more powerful. Ashford helped establish a formal structure, a legal aid fund, a network of attorneys willing to take fraud cases at reduced rates, a documentation system that made it easier to identify patterns of criminal land acquisition. By October, they'd helped restore property to 43 families across 4 territories. 43 victories against the kind of systematic theft that had once seemed unstoppable. But success brought new challenges. Marcus Sterling resurfaced in November, not in person, but through proxies and legal maneuvers. Despite the criminal charges, despite the exposure, despite everything, he was fighting back. New motions were filed challenging the property transfers, claiming they'd been coerced through false evidence and media pressure. The fact that he was doing it from somewhere beyond the reach of federal marshals made the legal assault even more frustrating. "He's not going to win," Ashford assured Alara and Rhett during an emergency meeting in late November. "The evidence against him is overwhelming, but he can drag this out, make it expensive and exhausting for everyone involved." "How long?" Alara asked, her hands clenched in her lap. "Months. Maybe longer." Ashford's expression was grim. "He's gambling that people will settle just to make it stop, that the legal fees and stress will break their resolve." "Then we make sure they don't break," Rhett said flatly. "The legal aid fund covers the costs. We front everything needed to fight this properly." "That could run into thousands of dollars," Ashford warned. "I have thousands of dollars," Rhett replied. "Sterling wants a war of attrition. He'll lose. I can outlast him financially, and I'm too stubborn to quit." Alara looked at him across the desk, seeing the steel in his eyes that had first frightened her and now reassured her. Rhett Calder kept his promises, no matter the cost. But she also saw something else, the toll this was taking on him. He'd thrown himself into the recovery network with the same intensity he brought to his ranch, but managing both was stretching him thin. He slept less, worked more, drove himself with relentless focus that worried everyone around him. "You need to rest," Alara told him after Ashford left, the two of them alone in the study as darkness gathered outside. "I'm fine." "You're exhausted. I can see it." "I've been more tired," Rhett said dismissively. "This is important, more important than sleep." "It won't be important at all if you collapse from exhaustion," Alara countered. "You taught me that sustainable effort beats desperate bursts. Practice what you preach." Rhett started to argue, then stopped, a wry smile crossing his face. "You're using my own logic against me. Because you're being stubborn and stupid." Alara softened her tone. "I appreciate everything you're doing, we all do. But you can't win a long fight if you burn yourself out in the first months. Pace yourself." "That advice coming from the woman who worked herself to bleeding hands last winter?" "Exactly. I know what I'm talking about because I've made the mistake." Alara stood, moving to the window. "Besides, I need you functional. The recovery network needs you functional. If Sterling's trying to outlast us, we need to prove we can go the distance." The practical argument reached Rhett in ways emotional appeals never would. He nodded slowly. "You're right. I'll delegate more to Jackson, cut back on some of the ranch expansion plans, focus on what matters most." "Good," Alara said. Then, more quietly, "Thank you for all of this. I know I say it too much, but I mean it every time." "You don't say it too much," Rhett replied. "And you're welcome." Winter came again, but this time Alara faced it from her own house, on her own land, with resources and support she'd built through her own efforts. The difference was staggering. Last winter she'd been squatting in an abandoned cabin, desperate and alone, working brutal hours just to survive. This winter she had a warm house, adequate supplies, and a future that extended beyond the next day. The anniversary of her first meeting with Rhett passed quietly. 1 year since he'd found her outside the Mackenzie cabin. 1 year since she'd accepted his impossible terms. 1 year since everything started changing. Alara marked the day by visiting Sophie's grave, something she did weekly now without the soul-crushing grief that had characterized earlier visits. The pain was still there, would always be there, but it had transformed into something she could carry without being crushed by it. I'm doing better, baby, Alara said quietly, kneeling beside the small marker. I got our home back. I'm helping other people who lost their homes, and I think I might be ready to live again. Really live, not just survive. The wind rustled through the oak tree's branches, and Alara let herself imagine it was Sophie approving, encouraging, blessing whatever came next. Christmas arrived with unexpected warmth. Rhett invited Alara to the main ranch house for dinner, a tradition he usually spent alone but wanted to share this year. She accepted, bringing bread she'd baked and preserves she'd put up from her garden's autumn harvest. They ate at the massive dining table that usually sat empty, talking about everything and nothing, the Recovery Network's progress, ranch gossip, plans for spring planting. The conversation flowed easily, comfortable in ways that had taken months to develop. After dinner, Rhett produced a wrapped package, setting it in front of Alara with uncharacteristic awkwardness. I'm not good at gifts, he said, but I saw this and thought of you. Alara unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a beautifully crafted wooden box, small enough to fit in her palm, with intricate carved details along the edges. When she opened it, she found a tiny horse carved from dark wood, a companion to the one Sophie had owned, similar in style, but clearly made by a master craftsman. I commissioned it from a woodworker in Denver, Rhett explained. Thought maybe, I don't know, thought it might be something you'd want to keep. Alara's vision blurred with tears. The thoughtfulness of it, the care it represented, the fact that Rhett had paid attention to such a small detail from their conversations months ago. It overwhelmed her completely. It's perfect, she managed. Thank you. There's something else, Rhett said. He pulled out a document, official and stamped. The final settlement from Sterling's bankruptcy proceedings came through. Frontier Holdings' remaining assets were liquidated. The court ordered restitution to all documented victims. How much? Enough that you can pay off your loan to me in full, with enough left over to expand your operation if you want, buy more livestock, additional equipment, hire permanent help. Alara stared at the document, understanding flooding through her. This meant complete financial independence. No debts, no obligations, nothing tying her to Rhett except what she chose. This changes things, she said quietly. It does, Rhett agreed. You're completely free now, to build whatever life you want, however you want to build it. The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning. This was Rhett releasing her from any perceived obligation, making clear that what came next, if anything came next, would be entirely her choice. The year's not up yet, Alara pointed out. You promised to ask me on July 15th. I did, but circumstances change. If you want to renegotiate the timeline, I don't, Alara interrupted. A promise is a promise. Ask me in July like we agreed. Rhett's relief was visible, though he tried to hide it. July it is. They spent the rest of Christmas evening by the fire, and for the first time Alara let herself imagine what saying yes might actually look like. Not loss of independence, but expansion of it. Not vulnerability as weakness, but vulnerability as strength. Not depending on Rhett, but choosing to build something together. The idea still terrified her, but it also thrilled her in ways she'd thought she'd never feel again. Winter ground on through January and February, brutal and unforgiving as always. But the Recovery Network's work continued. More properties were restored. More families found their footing. The legal battles with Sterling's proxies dragged through the courts, but Ashford was confident they'd prevail eventually. In March, unexpected news arrived. Federal marshals had finally caught Sterling in San Francisco attempting to board a ship to China. He was arrested, extradited back to Colorado, and faced trial on multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and theft. It's over, Ashford announced, arriving at Alara's farm with the news. He's in custody. The proxy lawsuits will collapse without his funding. We've won. Alara sat down heavily, the news washing over her like a wave. It was really over. Sterling would face justice. The properties were secure. The Recovery Network's work could continue without the constant threat of legal sabotage. How do you feel? Ashford asked. I don't know yet, Alara admitted. I've been fighting for so long that I don't know what to do when the fighting stops. You live, Ashford said simply. You build. You enjoy what you've earned. That night, Rhett came to celebrate. They sat on Alara's porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky, and let the victory settle into their bones. "We did it," Alara said softly. "We actually did it." "You did it," Rhett corrected. "I just helped." "You did more than help. You made it possible." "We made it possible," Rhett compromised. "Together." The word together hung between them, full of meaning and promise. They sat in comfortable silence, shoulders almost touching, and Alara felt something shift inside her. The fear that had governed her for so long was fading, replaced by something warmer, more hopeful. Spring arrived with explosive growth. Alara's fields turned green almost overnight, and she threw herself into planting with renewed energy. The restitution money allowed her to hire 2 full-time workers, young men eager to learn farming and grateful for steady work. She taught them everything her father had taught her, passing on knowledge that had been in danger of dying with her. The recovery network formalized further, with Ashford establishing it as an official charitable organization. Alara became its director, a role that terrified and fulfilled her in equal measure. She coordinated legal support, connected victims with resources, and served as living proof that recovery was possible. Other territories began requesting her help setting up similar networks. She traveled more than she'd expected, speaking to groups of victims, sharing her story, offering hope that justice wasn't just a fantasy. But she always came home to her farm, to the land she'd fought so hard to reclaim. June arrived warm and promising. Alara's crops looked better than she'd dared hope. Her livestock were healthy, and her farm was transforming into something sustainable and profitable. She'd proven to herself and everyone else that she could not just survive, but thrive. One evening in late June, Rhett invited her to ride with him up to the ridge overlooking both their properties. They climbed slowly, horses picking their way through rocky terrain until they reached the top. From there, the valley spread below them in all its harsh beauty. Rhett's vast holdings to the north, Alara's modest farm to the south, the town of Redemption Gap nestled between mountains in the distance. "I come up here sometimes," Rhett said, dismounting, "when I need perspective." Alara joined him, and they stood side by side, looking at everything they'd built and fought for. "Can I ask you something?" Rhett said after a long silence. "Of course." "Are you happy? Really happy? Not just surviving or managing, but actually happy?" Alara considered the question seriously. "Yes," she said finally. "I am. Not every moment, not perfectly, but overall, yes, I'm happy." "Good," Rhett said. "That's what I wanted to hear." "Why?" "Because what I'm about to ask, what I promised to ask in 2 weeks, I need you to answer from a place of happiness, not desperation or gratitude or obligation." Alara's heart started racing. "You're asking early." "I'm asking now because I can't wait anymore," Rhett admitted, "and because I think you already know your answer." He was right. She did. "Ask me," Alara said. Rhett turned to face her fully, his gray eyes intense and certain. "Alara Voss, will you partner with me? Not as employee and employer, not as charity and recipient, but as equals. Will you build a life with me, whatever that looks like, whatever form it takes? Will you trust me the way I trust you?" The question wasn't about marriage specifically, Alara realized. It was bigger than that. It was about choosing partnership, choosing connection, choosing to believe that strength could be shared rather than hoarded. "Yes," Alara said, the word feeling right and true and terrifying. "Yes, I'll partner with you." Rhett's smile was something Alara had rarely seen, genuine joy, unguarded and complete. He pulled her close, and they stood together on the ridge, 2 people who'd learned that survival alone was lonely, but survival together was something more, something worth fighting for. They didn't rush into anything dramatic. No immediate wedding, no sudden combining of properties, no grand gestures. Instead, they took time to build partnership the way they'd built everything else. Carefully, deliberately, with respect for what each person needed. Alara kept her farm and her independence. Rhett kept his ranch and his routines, but they made space for each other in ways that mattered. Shared dinners became regular. Collaborative decisions replaced unilateral ones. They learned each other's rhythms, preferences, fears, and dreams. The recovery network continued to grow, now with both their names attached to it. They traveled together to help establish similar organizations in other territories, sharing their story not as individuals but as a team. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, their separate lives intertwined into something new. By autumn, Alara had moved some of her belongings to the main ranch house, though she still maintained her farm as her own domain. By winter, they were openly acknowledged as partners by everyone in the territory. By the following spring, they were married in a simple ceremony attended by Recovery Network members, ranch workers, and the few friends who'd stood with them through everything. The wedding was held at Alara's farm, under the oak tree where Sophie was buried. It felt right to include her daughter in this new beginning, to acknowledge that moving forward didn't mean forgetting what was lost. "I promise to stand with you," Rhett said during the vows they'd written themselves. "Not for you or above you, but beside you. To share strength when you need it, and accept strength when I do. To build something together that neither of us could build alone." "I promise to trust you," Alara replied. "Not blindly, but with eyes open to who you are and what we can be together. To fight beside you when fighting matters, and rest beside you when fighting's done. To remember that partnership means choosing each other every day, not just once." They sealed the promises with a kiss, and the small gathering erupted in genuine celebration. That night, sitting on the porch of what was now their shared farm, Alara reflected on how impossibly far she'd come, from trespasser to landowner, from desperate to secure, from alone to partnered. "What are you thinking about?" Rhett asked, settling beside her with 2 glasses of whiskey. "How none of this should have been possible," Alara said. "How every logical outcome pointed toward failure, but somehow we won anyway." "We won because we fought," Rhett corrected. "Because you were brave enough to stand your ground that first morning, and I was smart enough not to run you off." "You think that was smart? Letting a trespasser stay?" "Smartest decision I ever made," Rhett said seriously. "You changed everything, Alara. Made me remember why any of this matters. Made me believe partnership was possible when I'd given up on it." "We changed each other," Alara said. "That's what real partnership does." They sat in comfortable silence, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but no longer frightening. They'd faced impossible odds before and prevailed. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. The Recovery Network continued its work for decades, helping hundreds of families reclaim stolen property and rebuild shattered lives. Alara remained its director until her 60s, finally retiring when younger advocates were ready to take over the mission. Rhett's ranch thrived under joint management, expanding through strategic acquisition rather than aggressive takeover. They became known throughout the territories as fair dealers, tough negotiators, and reliable partners. Together, they built something that lasted, not just property or reputation, but a genuine legacy of justice, partnership, and the radical belief that the powerful could be defeated when the powerless fought smart. Years later, when Alara was old and the frontier had transformed into something more civilized, a young reporter asked her the secret to surviving when everything was taken from you. Alara thought about it carefully before answering. "You survive by refusing to accept that theft is final," she said. "You survive by finding people who'll fight beside you instead of for you. And you survive by remembering that justice delayed isn't justice denied. It's just justice that requires patience and stubbornness and the absolute refusal to give up." "And love?" the reporter asked. "Where does that fit in?" Alara smiled, looking at Rhett across the room, older now, grayer, but still solid as the land they'd defended together. "Love is what you build after you've proven you can stand alone," Alara said. "It's choosing partnership when you don't need it, but want it anyway. It's the difference between surviving and living." That night, as they sat together on the porch of the ranch that had become truly theirs, Alara reflected on the impossible journey that had brought them here. From that frozen morning when a desperate woman faced a ruthless rancher across 50 yards of snow to this moment of hard-won peace, they'd fought corruption and won. They'd rebuilt what was stolen. They'd created something bigger than themselves, a network that continued helping others long after their own battle was won. But more than that, they discovered that strength didn't require isolation, that trust could be earned and honored, that partnership between equals was possible even in a world designed to favor the powerful over the powerless. "No regrets?" Rhett asked, as if reading her thoughts. Alara considered the question honestly. There was still pain. Sophie's loss would never stop hurting. Her husband's death would never feel fair. But regret? No. "No regrets," she confirmed. "Everything that happened, every struggle, every fight, It led here, to this, to us. I wouldn't change that. Neither would I, Rhett said quietly. They sat together as stars wheeled overhead. Two people who'd learned that the greatest victories weren't won through power or wealth, but through courage, persistence, and the revolutionary choice to stand together against systems designed to keep them apart. The frontier was changing, growing softer and more settled. But what they'd built, both the land and the legacy, would endure. Not because it was easy, but because it was earned. And that, Alara thought, made all the difference. The wind whispered through the valley, carrying the scent of growing things and the promise of harvests yet to come. Somewhere in the darkness, cattle lowed peacefully. The land that had been stolen and reclaimed, lost and found, now rested secure under their joint stewardship. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. It always did. But they'd face those challenges the way they'd faced everything else. Together, as equals, with the kind of partnership that transforms survival into something worth celebrating. As they finally went inside, Alara paused at the door, looking back at the valley one last time. This land had tested her, broken her, and ultimately remade her into someone stronger than she'd ever imagined she could be. It had given her back her future, and in Rhett, it had given her a partner worthy of that future. That was more than justice, that was grace, and it was enough.